at me and tell me what you see. I look at you and tell you what I feel. Look at me and tell me what you see. I look at you and tell you what I feel.
Welcome back. Now, seeing as we've had quite some time with good old Dr. Lecter, our next film will be similar, but dealing with a real-life monster, Jack the Ripper, in the film adaptation of the Alan Moore graphic novel of the same name, From Hell. And I say adaptation, however, this is one of the reasons why Alan Moore hates adaptations of his comic books. But all in good time. Let's take a look at the movie. The film begins with a quote allegedly from Jack the Ripper, although he never actually said that in any of the 3 letters he wrote, so it's ultimately pointless. The film just has a high opinion of itself, considering it's quoting itself. Over the opening titles, we get a very detailed look at someone preparing and smoking opium, revealing it to be our main character, Frederick Abberline, played by Johnny Depp. Which will be the first of many deviations, not just from the novel, but also history. Frederick Abberline, the lead investigator of the Ripper case, was nothing like he's shown in the film. Here, he's an opium addict because that makes his character more dark and edgy, which I wouldn't be as annoyed with if he didn't exist. The film's lost any kind of historical accuracy in the first second, so what the hell's the point? We're then introduced to some prostitutes, Mary Kelly and Catherine Eddowes, the Ripper victims, as Mary Kelly walks the street trying to make some money, which she's not very good at.
A penny for a suck.
Now, I point this out purely because a Victorian prostitute wouldn't refuse that offer. Considering your average laundry worker earned about 2 shillings and 8 pence, a shilling was 12 pence. You took what you could get back then. So the fact that she just tells the guy to piss off is the writer making sure that our love interest and secondary character Mary Kelly remains innocent and chaste in our eyes, because she actually doesn't do any business at all. As Mary Kelly walks, she's soon set upon by 2 men, members of the Nichols gang, who's extorting her and her friends, which all just sets up the big whodunit with many different suspects. The next day, the 5 women are at the public baths being greeted by another friend, Anne Crook, who needs Mary Kelly to look after her child, as she's meeting with her husband, Albert, who's been away, and before leaving, she promises to get the money for the women. And elsewhere, a man, John Netley, is threatened and told to make sure his charge gets home quickly and is unseen. John Netley was speculated to be complicit in the Ripper murders, and his prominence here shows that the film takes the majority of its theories from Stephen Knight's book, Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, eliminating the mystery. However, the original graphic novel wasn't a mystery at all, and Jack the Ripper was the main character whose motivations were known from the start. I know I keep pointing out inconsistencies, but I just want to be clear how little the film has to do with the graphic novel. There's then a brief sex scene with Anne Crook and her husband, but since this is a film about prostitutes, we can't have ordinary sex, so the authorities break in and interrupt, taking Anne and her husband quickly away, while the friends look on. And Anne Crook is then interrogated about what, we're not sure. She's just asked who knows. But naturally, it'll be the main focal point of our film. While one of the friends walks the streets, she's swiftly taken into a dark alley before she's violently stabbed to death. And the film does something pretty interesting here. The dead woman is Martha Tabram, and it's highly contested whether she was the first Ripper victim. Most say not, due to the method of death being completely different, but here it's left open to debate and ambiguous. However, as she was murdered round the corner from one of the Ripper suspects, George Chapman, and the man who I consider to be Jack the Ripper, I'd say yes, she was. We then move to the local opium den, where people are getting blitzed out of their minds, including Frederick Abberline, who, while chasing the dragon, has a vision of the movie's future events and the murders themselves, since, for reasons unknown, they've combined Abberline's character with that of a psychic who briefly helped with the case, but in reality he was a complete fraud. It's at that time Abberline's sergeant enters the building looking for him, giving Abberline a swift slap to wake him up, and then a dunk into some ice water. And before we move on, the idea of Chinese opium dens is a complete myth. Opium was freely available and liberally used in households. In fact, it was the British who sent China opium, and the Chinese threatened to stop sending us rhubarb if we continued. Rhubarb was valuable due to its laxative effects, and the Chinese were threatening to kill the British population through constipation. But Queen Victoria, in her most British of ways, never had the letter translated. Abberline tells the sergeant that he's seen something, and the sergeant confirms a grisly murder has taken place. And at the morgue they inspect the body, with the coroner refusing to show the wounds of her removed genitals, which is what makes this case of particular note. Later, we then move to the London hospital, as we're introduced to Sir William Gull, a physician, who's taken his guests to see the brutal and barbaric lobotomization of none other than Anne Crook. And we see the surgeon hammer the instrument into her head, turning her essentially into a vegetable, which would be bad enough if she was mentally ill, but since we know she's a prisoner, the situation is intensely more insidious. Also, it's quite nonsensical, because lobotomies, such as this, were first performed in Switzerland 2 years later, and weren't popular for another 10 years after that. One of the women is working and collecting payment, when she's attacked by the Nichols gang leader.
It's mine, Polly. It's my money.
And he seems to be really crap at getting money from people, if he attacks them before they hand over the money he's after. I mean, what the hell did he expect her to do, send the money via PayPal? A policeman quickly breaks up the altercation, and Polly is comforted by her friends. A bit too much for her liking, being kissed by one of the women, which she finds disgusting, so walks the street alone. But suddenly she's in a carriage with an unidentified man, clearly Jack the Ripper, with the stereotypical top hat and all. He gives her a drink while telling her about Cleopatra's Needle. It has a lot more significance in the novel, where everything the Ripper does relates to the architecture of London and his occult rituals, which are the murders. But as almost all the occult stuff has been completely slashed from the story, it's pretty irrelevant. The woman is unceremoniously murdered and then hideously mutilated in the street. That was probably still cleaner than your average hospital surgery at the time. The body is found sometime afterwards, so our detective investigates the scene, finding a grape stalk, which were incredibly expensive for the time. That, plus the fact she arrived in a carriage, points to someone of status committing the murder. And in the morgue, the coroner and his assistant examine the body. Well, actually, they take one look at it, and one guy falls unconscious, and the coroner looks to be coughing up a lung. But Abberline and the sergeant are perfectly stoic. It doesn't make much sense to me that a coroner who's literally opened people up and stitched them back together can't handle this. Which, firstly, is there to show just how horrific these murders are, because we couldn't see that already. And secondly, is to show how strong-willed our heroes are, even if it doesn't make much sense. The sergeant suspects this murder is by the Nichols gang, but Abberline disagrees, and then causes the coroner to retch again by telling him at least one of her organs is missing.
Oh no.
The coroner shouldn't be this goddamn affected by that. And if he is, then maybe he needs a different profession, for God's sake. Abberline briefs the patrol officers on the case with pictures of the real-life victims on the board, supposedly to unnerve the actors, but it just seems a bit tasteless to me. Afterwards, Abberline informs the commissioner of the situation, who's incurably Victorian about the whole thing. In other words, racist.
Well, one thing's for certain. An Englishman didn't do it.
Suggesting a Native American committed the murder. And he held up a flyer for a Buffalo Bill event, which I can't help but make connections to Silence of the Lambs. And the commissioner completely disregards Abberline's theory of an educated man being responsible, which is actually pretty accurate to the reaction of the time, telling Abberline to look for a butcher or tailor, specifically a Jewish one, so he's clearly of no use. But also what this film brings up is the question of whether the commissioner is just being a small-minded idiot, or he's deliberately trying to foil the investigation, which is an aspect that many theorise to be the case, although there isn't much evidence of that. And of course, after the news of who the police are looking for, there's chaos in the streets, which doesn't really lead to anything in the end, it's more for historical accuracy. I know, I'm asking what the bloody hell the point of that is as well. The next day, Abberline and the sergeant are at Polly's funeral trying to further the investigation. The women refuse to answer questions, accusing the Nichols gang again, and Mary Kelly gives Abberline an earful for being useless, which he seems to like. Just more setting up of the love interest thing. We then shift to the Ripper, who is of course eating the rarest piece of meat possible, and drinking what looks to be blood, just to emphasise to a ridiculous degree his evil nature, while we see many symbols of the Freemasons, as John Netley waits with the carriage outside. Again, the connection of Jack the Ripper to the Freemasons is from Stephen Knight's book, and to a lesser extent the novel. But there is almost zero evidence to support such a theory, and really it's only here due to the mysterious nature of the Freemasons, and it sounds a lot less ridiculous than saying the Illuminati or some equally stupid secret society.
Who controls the British crown? Who keeps the metric system down? We do. We do.
One of the women, Annie, is found by John Netley telling her his gentleman has been looking for her, offering her a bunch of grapes to convince her to get into the carriage, where she drinks the liquid laced with laudanum to pacify her. Netley takes her down the alley, horrified as he hears the murder occur. And in a rather cruel twist of fate, that would be that actress, Catherine Cartledge's last ever moment on film, as she died a year later of complications of pneumonia and septicemia. It's hard to bring down the mood during a movie about brutal murder, but I think that did it. The next morning, the police and the press have arrived at the murder scene, as Abberline notes the placement of Annie's belongings, that they make a 5-pointed star, which barely references the novel without follow-through. Abberline notes the grape stalk, coming to the conclusion that it isn't killing for profit, but ritual. Yet this will never be explained. Abberline requests to speak to a doctor from the Commissioner on the subject of the killings, as the police surgeon has neither a strong stomach or sober mind, which I can definitely agree with. But again, the Commissioner gets in the way of the investigation under the guise of not wanting to cause any more chaos. But let's put that on hold for a bit, while we have the bizarre aside to introduce Joseph Merrick, also known at the time as the Elephant Man. And I have no idea why it's in the film. Yes, it's in the novel, and yes, Joseph Merrick was around at the time of Jack the Ripper, but it serves no purpose whatsoever. It just stops the movie dead, with only the flimsy pretense of being able to get Abberline in there to speak with William Gull about the case, which could have been done elsewhere without the random deviation. Abberline tries to talk with one of the doctors. The professional's rebuff and racist rant convinces him to seek advice elsewhere, so he speaks to William Gull, asking him about the knife that was used in the murders, a Liston knife, which is a specialised surgeon's knife. Gull correctly spots Abberline's opium addiction, since he identifies laudanum, and once he writes a prescription for the inspector, Abberline sees that Gull is the physician to the royal family, which he was in reality, and also a Ripper suspect. All of this will be important later. And Gull tells the inspector that because of the direction of the cuts on the body, the Ripper is right-handed, and he confirms that the Ripper is almost certainly someone with thorough knowledge of human anatomy. Which is quite interesting, firstly because, due to a brain seizure, William Gull suffered weakness in his right hand, so it can't be him, right? However, since the investigation to present day, it's always been assumed that the Ripper was left-handed. So is this the film giving us a subtle clue there? So subtle it's close to being non-existent? Moving on in Whitechapel, Albert, Anne Crook's husband, is walking the street looking for her, but it's also the film trying to imply he's Jack the Ripper, by making him look suspicious as fuck with the classic look, and even John Netley driving the carriage. But like a lot of things in this film, it's irrelevant. We then move to Buckingham Palace, and Queen Victoria herself is asking William Gull about her grandson, who he tells her is very ill with an unknown disease, but it has neurological symptoms and a trembling of the right hand. Back at the station, Abberline explains that the location of the murders likely formed the beginning of a 5-pointed star. Wait, what? Hang on a second. There's only been 2 murders. So, by Abberline's own admission that Martha Tabram was not part of this, he's now thrown her back into the mix because that fits his pointed star hypothesis. Which, by the way, is such bollocks because he's just connecting 3 dots. There isn't a pattern in 3 friggin' dots. At John Netley's place, he's summoned Jack the Ripper to tell him how he can't handle the murders and doesn't know where he is anymore. So Jack tells him.
in hell.
Which to me sounds like flimsy justification for the From Hell letter Jack sent to the press, and where the movie and novel takes the name. But it's also just ridiculously overdramatic. But anyway, Abberline grabs Mary Kelly off the street to ask her a few questions. She offers to testify against the Nichols gang, but he won't let her do that, since it'll bring down the wrath of the gang with their leader in prison. So naturally, down in the pub, Abberline gets her story about Anne Crook. And what she tells him surprises the sergeant, as the men were police special branch, but neither of them know what or why they were there. The sergeant is suspicious, believing as Mary Kelly is Irish born, she's an Irish rebel. However, Abberline quickly points out it's Anne Crook they were after, but has the idea to sneak into special branch, which, after getting past the door officer, he finds very easy. And in the records room, he finds the file concerning Anne Crook and her child, finding out where she and the baby is now. God bless the British. 'Cause you know, regardless of how top secret, how essential it is that no one ever knows this information, it's still going to be filed away very neatly in a place that's easy to find. The next day, Abberline has taken Mary Kelly to the workhouse where Anne Crook is being held, as they're taken to a cell where Abberline and Mary Kelly try to ask her questions. But the operation has taken its toll, and she doesn't make much sense. And after hearing about Anne Crook's husband from Mary Kelly, Abberline takes her to a gallery to look at some paintings, specifically a painting of Prince Edward, who is in fact Albert, Anne Crook's husband, whom all the women were witnesses to at the wedding, which is more influences from Stephen Knight's book. Also the graphic novel, but the book was first. However, more importantly, how the hell was the prince never recognised by anyone for almost 2 years at the height of the British monarchy? He's the next in line to the throne, for God's sake. Abberline has gone to speak with William Gull, who's not surprised that the prince would marry Anne Crook. Yet him being Jack the Ripper is impossible because of his illness. The hand trembling is caused by syphilis. So Abberline's theory of revenge from the prince is impossible. Yet it was a popular conspiracy theory at the time. But also, come to think of it, the fact that they are calling the killer Jack the Ripper makes no sense, because he wasn't called that until the police received the Dear Boss letter after the 4th murder. So, where the hell did they get that name from? We then get a short aside to see someone initiated into the Freemasons, to remind us of a connection that is barely present in the movie, along with the supernatural aspects of the novel, and pays lip service to the source material. Back with Abberline, he's looking over the many letters supposedly sent by Jack the Ripper. He disregards them as rubbish, even though one of them starts Dear Boss, which is supposedly one of the few genuine ones in there. Abberline is then given the titular From Hell letter, which the movie considers the only genuine one. Which is strange to me, because aside from the overly dramatic statement of From Hell, of the 3 canonical Ripper letters, it's by far the worst written, with terrible spelling and grammatical errors, like spelling wait, W-A-T-E, and nice, N-I-S-E. Some speculate, however, that this is a deliberate misdirection, as the author correctly uses the silent K in knife. The letter also came with a preserved piece of human kidney, which is really the only thing making it possibly genuine. But of all the Ripper letters, it's by far the most divisive, so I'm not sure why the filmmakers and Alan Moore would use it. Back with the women, Mary Kelly is telling them about what she found out about Anne Crook's husband, when one of the others comes in with a very close friend, to say the least. Conversation is cut short, however, as Abberline shows up to talk with Mary Kelly. Abberline has arrested the Nichols gang, just covering all bases, I guess, and he gives Mary money for a place to stay, so she'll be off the streets, which then leads to a big kissing moment. Which has to be the perfect example of filmmakers adding in love interest subplots for absolutely no reason. Plus, it also makes it seem like Abberline wouldn't want to help Mary Kelly if he didn't want to bang her. Not the best message for your hero. And while the women rest in their room, one of the women, Liz, tries to kiss her newfound friend again, but is rejected, causing her to rather stupidly wander off into the night looking for alcohol. You'd think the imminent threat of a brutal and bloody death would make someone act a little bit more cautiously. Abberline is talking with the sergeant, telling him he's found out that the head of Special Branch is the one doing the killings, cleaning up the prince's mess.
Prince Edward married Anne Crook, a commoner and a Catholic. Married her in a Catholic church. They had a baby, a legitimate baby, who is in fact heir to the throne of England.
It all links into the theories that have been played out before, Unfortunately, it doesn't hold water, because the royal family wasn't permitted to marry in a Catholic church, meaning for the prince to keep his title and claim to the throne, he would have to disown his wife Anne Crook, which kinda blows the entire movie out of the water. But anyway, on to more murder, as Liz is picked up by the Ripper and lured into an alley. As he approaches, Liz sees the knife in a puddle, causing her to run, but John Netley stops her, and we then get a particularly gruesome killing. Due to the commotion, Jack doesn't have time to finish and has to leave. After observing the crime scene, Abberline's aware this murder won't satisfy the killer. Another of the friends is out looking for Liz, who's also quickly dispatched by Jack, and this time he has the time required. After wiping his hands clean, he decides to stir the pot a little bit, asking Netley for a piece of chalk, and both the body and message is found by Abberline, which was a genuine piece of graffiti said to be made by Jack the Ripper. The reason he wrote it in the film we'll get to, but for the most part, no one really knows what it was supposed to mean. Possibly just to create panic among the Jewish population of London, as they were already being scapegoated in the murders. Abberline tries to get a picture of the graffiti, but then the commissioner has to waltz up, ordering the photographer to leave. They wash the graffiti away in an effort to stop chaos ensuing, but Abberline insists on keeping it as evidence. But then the commissioner just suspends him. Yeah, the Victorian police weren't great at keeping evidence. That is true to history. Abberline's suspension, however, is not. Abberline goes to the pub and leaves a letter for Mary Kelly, which she picks up that night, being seen by John Netley, and returning to the room she finds cash in the letter. Back with Abberline, he researches the graffiti, going through the history of Freemasonry, finding a mention of 3 men, Jubela, Jubelo and Jubelum, and goes to speak with William Gull one last time. And back at the room, the other woman leaves, with Mary Kelly left alone, as John Netley sees through the broken window, so he can tell the Ripper. Now, this is a spoiler here, but Mary Kelly left in the other woman's clothes, so the film could have some kind of a happy ending to the love interest subplot. But a bit more clever than that is the fact that at the time, there were many contradictory eyewitness reports of seeing Mary Kelly after her time of death. So, for the record, the film quite cleverly explained that. Abberline tells Gull what he's found out about the Masons, that the Jews are the traitors who killed Hiram Abiff, founder of Freemasonry. The killings are reenactments of the men's executions, meaning the Ripper is a Mason killing traitors. Gull warns Abberline that he won't be allowed to be arrested, revealing himself, and that's when Gull becomes Jack the Ripper, with nonsensical black evil eyes, relating back to these supernatural aspects, all but forgotten for the film. And after Gull, or Jack, has told Abberline about the architecture of London, and he's what gives them meaning, leading to a quote we saw at the beginning,
Men will look back and say I gave birth to the 20th century.
Abberline cocks a gun, with a bit of a fuck-up from the makeup department, cause no upstanding inspector of Scotland Yard would have a tattoo. It just wouldn't happen. But before Abberline can pull the trigger, he's swiftly knocked out by the head of Special Branch, working with Gull. Which, if I may be the detective here for a moment, let's analyse what just happened. Outside the building, Abberline sees the guy waiting and enters before him. Now, there's feasibly only one proper entrance to the room, which Abberline walks through stage right. So when Abberline is looking at the fire, he's in full view of the door, and yet, when he gets hit, the guy has somehow gotten through the door, gone around Abberline to hit him from stage left, once again, somehow completely unseen by Abberline, despite being in his full field of view. So what the fuck just happened? The gods of plot holes just opened up a hellmouth portal of nonsense to make this scene work and justify its bollocks? So yeah, Jack is allowed to commit his final murder with Abberline in the carriage about to be drugged. But he fights back, knocking the doctor unconscious, and the officer out of the window, grinding his face on the wheel, causing the carriage to tip over, allowing Abberline to escape. At the room, Jack breaks in and strangles the woman, before mutilating her beyond belief. As Gull hallucinates, he's performing an anatomy class, talking about the human heart, taking the woman's and burning it in a teapot. The case notes do state it was on the fire so long the solder melted. And as the pot boils over, Gull's ritual is complete, so he's transported, or just hallucinates, him being applauded. Now, in the novel where Jack's motives are better explained, the ritual he performs is designed to subjugate women and for men to continue to rule over them. Yes, really, and once it's complete, Jack essentially ascends and becomes a god. Again, not joking. But yeah, that's pretty much Alan Moore all over, and I'm really glad the film removed all the metaphysical bollocks, frankly. Yes, it makes the film even less of an adaptation, but in this case, I don't mind. Abberline reaches the crime scene, far too late, to find the horribly mutilated remains. The Commissioner is also there, who Abberline attacks, wanting Gull, but Abberline is assured he'll be taken care of in his own way, reinstating Abberline to the case, to which he just spits at and strangles the Commissioner, having to be stopped by the Sergeant. What's interesting about the Commissioner being there is that at the time, he had retired from the police force, but he gave strict instructions to the officers not to enter the building until he got there. Which is weird, because all the other murders happened in the street, so how did he know that this one was in a building? But because the officers didn't realise he had retired, the crime scene was closed off for 5 hours before anyone even went in. Abberline looks understandably distraught as the officers go over the description of the scene, which is dialogue taken directly from the police report. But even the film had to tone down the gore, because Mary Kelly was so brutally murdered it would have made the film R-rated. Also, I'm glad they didn't place her intestines around the room like Christmas decorations, which was the reality. But while listening, Abberline spots the woman's hair is brown, all but confirming to him that the woman isn't Mary Kelly at all. Yet he can't say anything, as she'll be tracked down and killed. And at the pub, he finds a letter from Mary Kelly telling him that she's gone back home with Anne Crook's child. So, thank God, right? It was only a complete nobody who was murdered terribly, not the love interest. And at the Masons' headquarters, Jack is on trial by a jury of his peers, though he considers himself a higher power now with no peers. So, in a circular twist, Gull is lobotomized and left a vegetable, which is some kind of justice, I guess. And lastly, at the station, the sergeant tells Abberline to go find Mary Kelly, but he can't risk her life by letting people know she's alive. And the film gets the happiest of happy endings as we see Mary Kelly with the child. But Abberline quite literally smokes himself to death, which for opium is incredibly difficult to do. When the sergeant finds him trying to wake him up, he realises he's dead, placing coins in his eyes. So what a heroic end for one of London's most famous inspectors, eh? But yeah, that was From Hell, and like I said, I certainly see why Alan Moore hates adaptations of his novels now. From Hell, although likes to think of itself as an adaptation of the graphic novel, I think I've made it clear enough that it's just not. And essentially, it's just another Jack the Ripper murder mystery movie with very little to make it stand out above the pack, with its story either taken full cloth from another book, most of which was just wild speculation and conspiracy theories anyway. As a generic movie, it's not the worst and can be entertaining. But for someone like me, who considers themselves an amateur ripperologist, it's painfully inaccurate to a ludicrous level, where apart from the murders and characters' names, it's a complete fantasy. But hey, at least we had Johnny Depp doing his best London accent. Hey, core blimey, governor, hey, would you Adam and Eve it, hey? And now I think I'm pretty much done with serial killers, which is good, because next week it's time for H.P. Lovecraft Month. See you next time.